Welcome. Thank you for joining us on today's webinar hosted by the National Center for Pyramid Model Innovations. My name is Victor Trinidad. This webinar is part of the Within the Framework webinar series.
Hi, everybody. I'm Lisa Fox with the National Center for Pyramid Model Innovations. I'm super excited to be here with Leslie McIntosh, who is one of our Pyramid Model fellows. So he and I met, I guess about 2 years ago, right, Leslie, when he applied to become a PMI fellow. We have applications out right now, 5 more days left. A PMI fellow is carefully selected as being our next generation of leaders in pyramid model implementation. And Leslie and I shared a lot of interest, and we were able to really dig into this work around executive functions. I'm super excited that he's going to be able to share with you things he knows about executive function and how he really guided me in thinking about what the pyramid model practices do in helping our little ones learn executive function. So Leslie, go ahead and take it away.
Hi everyone, I'm Leslie. As Lee says, I'm an NCPMI fellow, and I'm also a school psychologist with Jersey City Public Schools. I work in the early childhood department, and we use the pyramid model to support all young children. As you are all really familiar, I'm sure, my particular area of expertise is executive function and how preschoolers develop executive function. My dissertation work actually followed the growth of children's executive function from 3 to 4. And there are lots of interesting things in the research that I found that relate to pyramid model practice as it exists right now. And so that's what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about the special thing that you've already been using, you just didn't necessarily know you were. So we're going to talk about what executive functions are. We're going to discuss what executive skills are, which are a little bit different than the functions themselves. We're going to talk about how the brain brings them all together. And we're going to talk about ways that we're already using them in the pyramid model and ways that we can do that even more. And we're going to start by watching a little video that's going to give you a little bit of overview in a fun way about what executive functions look like and how they work.
Touch your knees. Good job. Touch your shoulders. Touch your shoulders.
Head, shoulders, knees, and toes is very similar to Simon Says. So there's a leader who gives instructions, and then the children have to follow those instructions.
Touch your head. Touch your toes. Touch your toes.
The head, toes, knees, and shoulders task is a more recent task that looks at behavioral aspects of self-regulation. Self-regulation is at the basis of thoughtful behavior and underlies performance in most areas of school learning.
This must be a big stuff game.
In the first part of the game, head and toes are introduced.
Are you ready? No? If I say touch your head, what are you going to touch?
My toes.
That's right. And if I say touch your toes, what are you going to touch?
My head.
That's right.
But I'm going to go a little bit faster. Touch your head. Touch your toes. In the second part of the game, the children are introduced to having to touch their knees and their shoulders. Touch your knees. Touch your knees. Touch your shoulders. Touch your knees. The third part of the game means incorporating parts 1 and 2. So the children have to hold in mind different behaviors in terms of touching their knees, touching their shoulders, touching their toes, touching their head, and doing the opposite of what they're told.
Touch your shoulders. Touch your toes.
In this game, we can see that children have to not only pay attention, they have to also remember instructions as the game goes on and builds in complexity, and they also have to control their motor responses. Touch your head. All right, touch your shoulders. Well, the game might seem really simple, but it's actually quite challenging even for adults.
Touch your knees.
All the kids did really great with it, especially Alfie, who really even showed his mom how it was done.
Good job. High five.
So that is a quick splash of what executive functions are, and I'm going to explain a little bit more. So executive functions are the overall cognitive capacities that control our ability to pay attention, to focus, to switch between different ideas that we have, and also to even be empathetic with each other to a certain degree. As you just saw, those kids, all of them, none of them were more than the age of 5. They were put in a unique situation, a novel situation, where what they were expected to do, which is head, shoulders, knees, toes, that whole head, shoulders, knees, and toes, they were asked to flip and switch that and be flexible. They were asked to inhibit responses that they were more likely to make before, and to do something else completely different based on a new situation. That's all executive function. That all is coming from one particular place. Executive functions are interrelated. It's not just one particular center of the brain that's controlling everything. As people, typically like to say, the CEO of the brain. It's actually a little bit more complicated. Executive functions are complicated. They exist all over the brain. And executive functions are present from birth. They start as early, we can see evidence of them as early as infancy, and then as children get older and reach adulthood, that's when they mature. Okay, so these are the executive functions. This is just a brief overview of them. Response inhibition, being able to do what those kids did, which is be able to control their environment, control their responses, hold a response that they want to give. They wanted to touch their head when they were told their head. So response inhibition is being able to control that, and working memory is being able to use information flexibly in your mind. And everything else is pretty straightforward and explanatory. These are the overall capacities that exist in our brains when we talk about executive function. Executive skills are the strategies that are basically what executive functions look like in real life. So for response inhibition, that could look like waiting. Or for cognitive flexibility, it could be you thinking out of the box or being creative. For inhibition, that could be you being more precise and not necessarily doing the first thing that comes to your mind. So executive skills are what things actually look like when you need to use your executive functions in real life. Executive functions are connected to executive skills, but they aren't necessarily the same. They don't necessarily appear in the same time frame. There's a lot of variability in development, and that's not something that's a surprise to anybody on this call, because we know that early childhood development is flexible, and so executive function development and skill development, that's going to be really flexible as well. So we've all heard the same that same age-old idiom, which came first, the chicken or the egg? And that might be something that some of you are wondering about right now. What's first, executive function or executive skill, the cognitive capacity or the behavioral manifestation? What comes first? What happens first? So as I said, executive skills may or may not develop alongside their executive function. But they do influence each other. So as I mentioned, there's a bidirectional connection, and this is particularly true in early childhood. The environments that we put children in have a huge impact on the skills that they're able to learn and demonstrate. And we see that in the pathway system of the brain. So in adults, executive capacity is primarily housed in the prefrontal cortex, but in children who don't necessarily have a fully free prefrontal cortex at this particular point, the executive skills and the functions are housed throughout the brain through pathway systems that feed into the frontal lobe. So brain function in young children relies on a whole bunch of different, functional roads and connecting little highways that go into the brain and ultimately make the frontal lobe stronger. So active pathways feeding into the frontal lobe encourage more robust executive function potential throughout development into adulthood. Learning environments that are rich with opportunities for executive skills to be used are going to produce environments where children's frontal lobes are more stimulated, which is ultimately going to help those frontal lobes trigger executive skills more efficiently and more effectively. And so this is a visual of how the whole thing comes together. So pre-K teachers, you're primarily living in the world of the executive skill. As I talk about this to some teachers, a lot of teachers will respond, well, executive function has to do with the brain, and I'm just a teacher. I don't really know what my place in that is. I don't really know how that particular thing works. And that's fine. Like, you don't necessarily have to be a school psychologist or, write a dissertation in executive function. What's important for pre-K teachers to know, and for people who support pre-K teachers, is that you guys build executive skills. And as you build executive skills, those executive skills get stronger. And as those executive skills get stronger, the executive functions in the prefrontal cortex get stronger, which ultimately leads to kids being able to use those skills more effectively in the future throughout life. So basically, by focusing on the behavioral skills that are linked to the cognitive capacities, we can make the overall cognitive capacities stronger, which is ultimately going to show us stronger executive function outcomes for kids as we see them develop through life, which is what we want from, all kids and always, and that includes the social emotional. So these are executive functions and their skills. So as we talked about, response inhibition is waiting. If we are giving kids chances to practice waiting, that executive skill, that particular pathway that feeds into the prefrontal cortex, where response inhibition is primarily going to be housed in the future, that prefrontal cortex is going to be stronger, because this is a child who has a lot of experience practicing using that particular skill. And so that particular prefrontal cortex of that child is going to be able to activate waiting a lot more easier than a child who has no experience with it whatsoever, or limited experience, I should say. So pre-K teachers focusing on the green, using language that you can remember easily and that you can practice with the kids, ultimately that's going to lead back into executive functions being stronger for you in your classrooms in the moment, as well as in the future later in life. And that's where the whole pyramid model piece comes into play. A lot of these things are things that, I'm looking for on my teapot. I'm looking for whether or not children are practicing skills, whether or not there are structured opportunities for kids to use social emotional skills, and unstructured opportunities for kids to use, to have structured and unstructured opportunities to practice using skills. And that is some of the things that executive function could benefit from. As you can see, there are 4 particular areas in the research that talk about how executive function in early education can be improved through intervention. Numbers 2, 3, and 4, improving teacher-child interactions and using play as a context for development, as well as social-emotional learning. All of these things relate really, really well to the pyramid model. So in the pyramid model, we already have a context that supports social-emotional learning. We already have a context that supports nurturing responsive relationships and supportive environments. We already have everything that we need. Well, not everything. We have 2 of the 3 already well represented in the pyramid model as it is. Through coaching, those of you who are not pre-K teachers but supporters of teachers, you can actually assist teachers in a context that's already natural to you. You don't necessarily need to do anything new. If you just do the pyramid model as it is, we're already covering most of what needs to be covered in order to support children in terms of developing executive function skills and executive function in general. And this is really, really important for those of us who have been working with the model for a while. I've been teapotting for a bit, and some of my teachers get really, really, really good, and then, well, where do we go? And then I sometimes get questions, well, you know, my teapots are in the 80s and 90s, and I've been like doing the coaching and things are going well. What else can I do? And those are genuine questions. I did a teapot this particular school year where we had a situation, me and my instructional coach partner had a situation where a teacher performed so well. We were lucky that she gave us something to coach on regarding problem solving. But aside from that, she had a really, really, really good teapot. She really, truly understands the model. And so now there's this question of, well, how do we grow within the model? How do we help the model grow so that we can grow with it? In my particular story, I was able to introduce executive function. I was able to talk about cognitive flexibility, and I was able to talk to this particular teacher about ways that her pyramid model practices that she's already really good at could be used to support children in a different way. So it wasn't really so much a matter of the teacher having to learn everything that I knew about executive function. She just needed to know that what she knew already about supporting children's developmental skills using practices that are already pyramid model, those were enough. So that leads us to, how can we grow? What can we do? The pyramid model is great. I already told you that we already knew that we're all here for that particular reason. And I already told you that 2, 3, and 4, improving teacher-child interactions, using play as a context and social emotional learning are already well represented in the model. Well, how do we grow? Well, this first piece here, where we talk about direct training of executive function skills, that would be where. So in my research, I found that a lot of what is done to teach executive functions to 3 to 5-year-olds is really laboratory intensive. It's very narrow. It doesn't necessarily mesh well ecologically with what we know and what we understand about child development typically. Staff need to know almost as much as I do about executive function in order to be able to do it. And the outcomes that we get from teaching executive functions using really specific curricula, we don't see them transfer or generalize outside of those particular experiments, those particular laboratory situations. So on its face, the notion of direct training of executive function skills, you know, many of us would be skeptical about it. And rightfully so. It doesn't necessarily look that great from the research as it is. However, if we look at it through the lens of the pyramid model, there's actually opportunity that we could introduce direct training of executive function skills into typical practice. So this is a resource that is available. It's up now on NCPMI, and it basically walks you through understanding ways that you can link pyramid model practices to executive skills. Because again, we want to focus on teaching executive skills to preschoolers through the pyramid model so that their executive functions become stronger. Table 1 of the resource tells you, it gives you great definitions for what executive functions are. They tell you also what the executive skills are, so the actual behavioral manifestation of what it is that we're looking for. And it also tells you what these things look like for older toddlers. So for those of you who are in infant toddler classrooms, ages 2 to 3, and preschoolers, which is, you know, my home territory, 3 to 5, what exactly these things look like. And then it also breaks out into what pyramid model practices you see here overlay onto the functions and the skills. So these here are essentially some pyramid model practices that I'm sure all of you are already well aware of, that you use already to develop social emotional skills, like the teacher that I used in my example. But you can also use them to think through and plan for supporting executive skills. You know, explaining, you know, preparing them for what's going to happen beforehand in detail, letting them know before the morning message that you're going to introduce waiting. We're going to talk about what that particular skill means, modeling it. So actually showing waiting and actually saying, look, this is waiting. Hey, everybody, pay attention. I'm going to show you what it looks like to wait, and then doing it. Supporting kids in both structured and unstructured settings. So giving them an opportunity to, in small group or large group, practice one of the executive skills. And then also looking during their unstructured time, any high school people on the call, work time, trying to set up some opportunities for them to use those executive skills during those unstructured times. You know, those of you who are teapot users, you'll know that as an indicator from item 8, teaching social emotional skills and social emotional competencies. Using positive reinforcement in a naturally occurring way so that kids are motivated to use those same skills again in the future. Helping them reflect on how great it was that they used those skills, and labeling the skills so that way they're used to it. They understand that this is a skill, like this is something, you know, like friendship skills or problem solving skills, expressing emotions. These are things that I can do. My teacher can ask me to do them, and it'll probably be a good idea for me to do them. And remembering them later in life, you know, sharing those labels with kindergarten teachers perhaps so that they can more easily access the same skills that you've spent the whole school year developing, or 2 school years, however long you've been with your kids, because these skills aren't necessarily going to stop being useful once pre-K ends. These are life skills. Executive skills are life skills.
All right, so good introduction to what executive function, executive skills, how the brain develops them, and then how we might foster them with pyramid practices. One of the questions is, could you talk through a little bit, if you were advising a teacher about teaching a lesson in one of them, and you might have to back up, I don't know if you can, back up to one of your tables, but if you were guiding a teacher to label, can you just unpack that a little bit more? Like, what would that sound like? What might a teacher say to a 4-year-old about one of those particular executive skills?
So in terms of labeling, just go for the name that you gave the skill. These are I'm not sure that I can go back, but you guys are going to get the PowerPoint. Just remember that the skills are in one of the slides where there was the red, which was the executive function, and then the skills were in green. The executive skills are the friendship skills, or the problem-solving skills that you're used to identifying in kids and reinforcing anyway. So just like you would say, oh, you're such a great problem solver, Jimmy. That was such a great way that you helped Susie find her such and such, or wow, thank you for being such a great friend. Just like you say friend or problem solving, say those terms in green. Or you could make up your own. Whatever it works easiest for you, just keep it consistent so that the kids understand that, okay, this is what I have to do. Whenever Miss Michelle says, wait, my body isn't moving, I'm looking at her, my mouth isn't talking. That's labeling. Give the skill a name that you keep consistent, and use it, practice it, reinforce it.
Great, that's a good example. I think it's just so different, right, Leslie, to call it an executive skill or start talking to children about it in that way And that what feels new and a little bit awkward. So I was interested in, when I ran through the skills, I was interested in metacognition, and your equivalent was checking yourself. And I don't think I see a lot of that in a pyramid model classroom. Could you just describe that a little bit? Like, how does helping kids check themselves link to metacognition? But what does that look like in a 4-year-old?
Well, keeping it consistent with pyramid model, if you think to the expressing emotions section of the teapot, those particular practices that lead you to be aware of your own emotional states, that would be a pretty close throw to metacognition. Metacognition is basically just being aware of what's going on inside your own mind. So like any sort of expressing emotions, like you have to know what's going on inside of you in order to express it to another person. So anything that you do that relates to kids being able to express themselves, you can just trust that you're hitting metacognition there. I wouldn't necessarily get too hung up on the language with that particular executive function, because metacognition is a little bit of a reach for 3- and 4-year-olds. Really, most of them, all of them are big reaches if you expect them to use them the way we do. But by just focusing on things that you already do that are naturally close, like linking metacognition, or at least in your mind thinking of it as close to expressing emotions, you're going to get so much mileage out of the kids just by doing that.
So I hear you saying metacognition. When I saw checking yourself, I thought of things like self-monitoring, but it sounds like that's a little bit, that's not quite what we're talking about, right? It's a more in the moment awareness, is that right? Versus the looking back?
Well, both.
Okay.
If you want to get really, really adventurous and you want to start a self-monitoring classroom intervention with your young ones, that is not something I would discourage. Being very mindful that, you know, we have to expect them to fail. Self-monitoring is basically, for those who don't know, it's basically monitoring your own behavior and making judgments and evaluations of our own individual behavior, which would be like a higher level example of metacognition. If you're not used to talking about these things, I wouldn't start there. I wouldn't go crazy with it. But when you start to get a little bit comfortable, the research will show you examples of self-monitoring intervention that could be really, really useful and interesting to you.
Great. So a question from someone in the group is, do you think Simon Says is a good way to help teach listening skills, organization, and thinking in a pre-K classroom?
I think Simon Says is an excellent, excellent way. You have to use sustained attention. You have to use response inhibition. You have to use cognitive flexibility. All of these things are in that one particular game. What I would suggest that you do is look at the practice guide that is up on NCPMI and use that as a way to consider what particular executive functions you're accessing and to start labeling them and use those labels.
That sounds great.
It's such a good question. You know, to think of that alone gives me so much hope that this really is, I mean, like me and Lisa talked about this so much. We know it's accessible, but that you guys are asking these questions, it's really encouraging. Like, you can do this. This is really, really very doable.
Great. So Victor's running our webinar for us. Can we go backwards with the slides? Is that not possible in this? I'm just
tell me which slide you want to go to.
Go back until I tell you to stop. How about that? Because I think the audience and myself, I want to kind of look at, all right, go up, go forward, I think. And I think one more. Yeah, no, maybe the best slide is the green and function slide, because I just want to wrap my head around the whole list, right? As we talk about it. There, that's good. I think that helps me think about this as well. So
Mhm.
one of the participants wants to know, how do we try, as a teacher, that's a big list. How do we think about or prioritize which executive skill we might work on first or with children? Kind of how does that all fit together? How do you guide your teachers in that?
I would typically use teapot results, either teapot results or consistent visits and things that I see in their practice that I can naturally think of relating to this particular content. So kids who can transition, task initiation, I go there. Kids who, like, if it's a classroom where engagement seems to be low, sustained attention, I go there. If this is a classroom where it just seems like the schedule is just not, kids just, have a hard time learning and being consistent with the schedule, organization, I might go there, and time management, I might go there. But then I'm someone who is deeply familiar with the content, so I'm prepared to do that. What I would do is I would really just, for those of you who are new to this, the practice guide, it actually has pyramid model practices and their related functions and skills laid out for you. So what I would do is I would start with the pyramid model practices that you yourself as practitioners know are not necessarily your strongest suit or your toughest hat, and look at the executive functions and associated skills that are related to those pyramid model practices, and that would be where I would suggest that you start, and it's easier for you to, I want to keep this as simple and easy to understand as possible, which is why I'm linking it to the pyramid model, that, and also that the research is naturally conducive to what the pyramid model is already advocating for. But I don't want teachers to get headaches. I don't want them to think that, their world is changed. It really isn't. It really is not. Executive function is already in the pyramid model, and it is already in your practice. You just have to get used to looking at it, looking for it, and seeing it as that. And the practice guide, I think, will do lots of favors for you in that regard. So again, just go to the pyramid model practices, look for what maybe you want to focus on more, like it could be something that was uncovered during a recent cycle of practice-based coaching, and just see what executive functions and their skills would strengthen those pyramid model practices for you.
So that's great. Some people are asking about the practice guide. So it is posted with the webinar on the webinar page as a resource, so you can get it there, and it's on challengingbehavior.org. And when Leslie and I worked on it together, I really learned a lot. I mean, I did what you are doing right now. It's like, well, what does this look like? And how do you do this with a 4-year-old? Because it does feel a little awkward and jargony, and we haven't thought about our practices that way. And it is both our practices, but it's also about children's capacities, right, Leslie?
Mm-hmm.
So isn't that another way to look at it? Like, does a child not inhibit, or does a child lack emotional control? Would that be another lens we might look at the functions and then map back to the skill that I might do extra teaching in a targeted fashion?
Absolutely, absolutely. The skills, the functions themselves are going to be hard to pinpoint in young children as clearly as we would in adults. But it's never too early to teach a skill or to start building a skill. Mm-hmm. There never is a time that is, well, if you look at the practice guide, you'll see we did give some developmental examples of what an executive skill could look like.
There we go.
Yep. So if you look here in table 1, there's examples that we give you of what you could expect to see in terms of executive function development typically.
Great.
And if you see this, then it doesn't mean that you don't necessarily need to teach executive skills, because you do, but you don't necessarily need to be worried that the child is not developing typically, particularly from just the lens of, the anecdotal report of classroom level. But if you see that, there are basic deficits, again, we're not going to raise the alarm, but we're going to teach directly towards those deficits, those skill deficits.
Great. All right, so here's a really good question, and I don't know the answer. I'm hoping you do. or maybe it's a depends kind of answer. So do the skills develop in a particular order, and do they build on one another?
It's so funny that you say that. My mentor, as I was first being trained in this, one thing that he said, what people would ask him, so does this measure executive function like this way? And he says that the right answer to those questions is, in fact, always, well, it depends. So yeah, it depends. I don't necessarily advocate for us trying to create a specific developmental hierarchy or, set of milestones, as it were, for this particular age group, because the function of the prefrontal cortex is still really, really immature, has a long way to go before it stabilizes in adulthood. And so it's really more appropriate and more helpful, to be honest, to look at the skills and focus on the skills. If we start talking about milestones and things like that, then that's getting into like my particular area of assessment in school psychology. And even I don't try to get that granular with this particular age range.
So we're all trying to learn this, so bear with us. One participant, and I have to admit, it was confusing for me, and you and I worked on it quite a bit. Can you give us the 3-sentence explanation of the difference between an executive skill and executive function, so that I can start explaining it to my families and to teachers I support?
Mm-hmm. We can get simpler than 3. I think I might be able to give you 2. Executive functions are in the brain. Executive skills are in the environment. Or another 2 sentences, executive functions are invisible. Executive skills are very visible, especially if you don't have them and we want you to.
All right, here's a good question. Is it true that older children who have challenging behavior, is some of that about the lack of capacity of one of those executive skills, or should we be thinking about executive skills and executive function, for example, when we do a functional behavioral assessment?
Oh, I love that question. That's such a good question. There are, I would say, yes. And there are resources actually that you can use to do that. There are questionnaires that can basically break out, is this, and I could actually share with Lise in the center one. It actually does give you like something of a number score, kind of like those of you who are used to providing behavioral support, you're familiar with the MAS or the FAST. It can function like that. Of course, it's just, it's not anything for you to do anything diagnostic or make any sort of outside referral based on, but it is something to consider, and it keeps it in your mind as you're conceptualizing what sort of interventions make sense, what else is playing into the function of this behavior besides just behavior. Some kids, executive dysregulation is not something that we are going to say at 3 or 4, but it is something that, it might be a little bit on our minds. And in terms of, prevention, PTRC, in terms of these sorts of things, an executive level prevention strategy could actually be a huge, huge thing that you could do.
Great, thank you. All right, so here's another one that I think is so relevant to our work. Do we think that executive skills may vary because of a child's upbringing or home environment? And then also, is there a cultural influence on executive skill development?
That goes right back to the question, that thing that one of my mentors told me, which is it depends. And that's absolutely true. Nobody's brain is the exact same as anybody else's. And so no one's executive journey is going to be the exact same as someone else's. Different cultures will embrace different skills more than others. Some cultures will embrace response inhibition much, much more than others, inhibition in general more than others, and so on and so forth. So yes, that is a lens, absolutely. Maternal warmth, that's something that relates to, I didn't address it explicitly in this particular session, but the research shows that parents who have the quality of mind-mindedness, which is, it's actually another pyramid model practice. In the pyramid model, we talk about adults identifying their own feelings. That's basically mind-mindedness, which is you identifying your own cognitive states. I'm really distracted, or I'm focused right now. I'm really concentrating, using language like that with kids. That is really help. We talk about something called autonomy support. So parenting strategies that allow children to have safe autonomy, which is something that I think we all in this call understand and appreciate. These are children who have stronger executive function outcomes typically than children whose parents function as their frontal lobe, as it were, organizing every little thing and planning every little thing and leaving no freedom to the kid. So yeah, there's a lot of difference. There's a lot of difference.
Yeah, as I hear you explain it, then I could see how we have so much diversity in caregiving and family context and environments that do, whether or not you have an expectation that a child will have initiative or be organized or problem solve for themselves, or if you do it for them, and if you, that's so fascinating. Have people thought about how we translate some of this research for families to learn more about it? I mean, I would think some things we don't try to change and influence, but I would think if a child's in a situation that's highly chaotic and they're not learning these skills, it feels like as practitioners, we would want to partner with families and share some of this information, because these executive functions are so critical, right, to the lifestyle outcomes I think that all parents want for their children. I don't know, what are your thoughts?
In terms of packages that are related specifically to parents, that's something that we need to grow. That's an area we definitely need to grow in. The closest that comes to mind for me is Ellen Galinsky's Mind in the Making program, which isn't directed specifically towards parents. It's you can get trained in it through Head Start, and at this point, it's even beyond Head Start. People in the community, like general people, can take this training, and it's meant to help understand the life skills. Talk about, I mentioned before executive skills are life skills. I think I was channeling Ellen Galinsky when I said that. That's her slogan, and rightfully so. The programming is really general, and it's made to be accessed by anybody who's interested.
Great. Actually, a bunch of people were chatting about that just as you started saying it. Look at Mind in the Making and access Mind in the Making. Well, this was a wonderful conversation, Leslie. I think the guide is going to be really helpful for all of us to work through and to learn more about. Oh, there's also a comment in the chat about Vroom, and Vroom does really unpack a lot of this for families specifically. So I'm excited to have pyramid practitioners be able to really look at the powerful pyramid practices in a new way. And I thank you so much for coming and presenting and fielding some of these questions. We have more, but we just don't have time to get to it. Thank you, Leslie.
Yes, thank you so much to Leslie for his wonderful insights in this presentation. So your feedback is very important to the work we do. Please remember to provide your feedback on this webinar with our post-webinar survey by typing the web address shown on this slide into your internet browser. Your certificate of attendance will appear once you submit the survey. We invite you to visit our website, challengingbehavior.org, to sign up for our upcoming webinars, access recordings, download pyramid model resources, and more. We wish to thank our funder for making this webinar possible. This concludes our webinar. Thank you all and have a great rest of your day.